The torn fabric hung in the air like a battle flag, the sound of ripping cotton echoing through Jefferson High's gymnasium louder than any cheers that had ever filled those walls. Madison Chun stood motionless, her emerald prom dress destroyed, her dignity under attack, but her eyes burned with something nobody in that room had ever seen before. The moment that would change everything wasn't the humiliation they thought they were witnessing. It was the awakening of a storm that had been quietly building for 4 years. But this story doesn't begin with torn fabric and public shame. It begins in the shadows of a chemistry lab, where brilliance learned to hide itself, and where the quietest voice in Roosevelt Valley was about to discover just how loud silence could scream. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The periodic table on the wall of Mrs. Patterson's advanced chemistry classroom had become Madison Chun's sanctuary, each element a friend that never judged, never whispered, never turned away when she entered a room. She sat in the back corner by the window, always the same seat, always 15 minutes early, her textbooks arranged in perfect order, like shields protecting her from a world that seemed determined to remind her she didn't belong. Madison had learned the art of invisibility by necessity. At 17, she moved through Jefferson High like a ghost, her shoulder-length black hair falling forward to create a curtain between herself and the world, her clothes carefully chosen to blend rather than stand out muted grays, soft blues, nothing that would catch an eye or invite attention. She had perfected the posture of someone apologizing for existing, shoulders slightly hunched, steps quick and purposeful, eyes focused on destinations rather than people. But behind that carefully constructed camouflage lived a mind that blazed with curiosity and ambition. Madison Chun wasn't just smart, she was extraordinary. Her IQ had been measured at 167 when she was 12, though she'd never told anyone at school. Her parents, Dr. James Chun and Dr. Sarah Chun, both professors at Roosevelt Valley University, had raised her to understand that intelligence was a gift to be nurtured, not flaunted. They had immigrated from Taiwan when Madison was 3, carrying nothing but advanced degrees and unshakable faith in education as the pathway to the American dream. The Chun household was filled with academic journals, scientific discussions over dinner, and the gentle pressure of parents who had sacrificed everything for their daughter's future. Madison thrived in that environment of intellectual stimulation, but the transition to American social dynamics had never come naturally. While other kids learned to navigate friendships and popularity contests, Madison found refuge in equations and lab experiments, in books that made sense when people didn't. Her transcript read like a love letter to academic excellence. 4.0 GPA, a P classes since sophomore year, president of the Science Olympiad team, winner of 3 state-level chemistry competitions, and early acceptance to MIT with a full scholarship waiting for her signature. She had spent the last 2 summers conducting research at her parents' university, working on polymer chemistry projects that had already caught the attention of graduate programs across the country, but none of that mattered in the social ecosystem of Jefferson High, where worth was measured in followers, dates, and proximity to the golden circle of athletes and cheerleaders who ruled the hallways like benevolent dictators. Madison existed in the margins, noticed only when teachers called on her to solve problems others couldn't, making her brilliance feel more like a burden than a gift. She had one friend truly won, and that was enough. Oliver Martinez had been her lab partner since freshman year, a quiet boy with gentle eyes and an artist's soul who understood what it meant to be different. Oliver was gay in a school where being different still felt dangerous, and he and Madison had formed an alliance of outsiders, protecting each other through shared silence and unspoken understanding. They ate lunch together in the library, studied together after school, and communicated in the shorthand of people who had learned that the world was safer when experienced in pairs. The bullying had started subtly, as it always does. Whispered comments about her clothes, jokes about her accent that had faded years ago, but somehow still marked her as foreign in their eyes, exclusion from group projects until teachers forced participation. Madison had learned to absorb it like background noise, focusing instead on her goals, her research, her future that stretched beyond the suffocating walls of high school social hierarchy. But recently, something has shifted. The attention had become more focused, more deliberate, centered around one person whose presence seemed to suck the oxygen from any room he entered. Cameron. Stewart was everything Madison was not. Loud where she was quiet, cruel where she was kind, celebrated where she was invisible. He stood 6 feet tall with the kind of athletic build that came from 4 years of varsity football, and a metabolism that forgave every indulgence. His blonde hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes expensive, but worn with calculated casualness. And his smile, that devastating smile, could charm teachers, parents, and classmates into overlooking behavior that should have had consequences. Cameron came from Roosevelt Valley royalty. His father, Robert Stewart, owned the largest construction company in 3 counties and sat on the school board. His mother, Linda Stewart, chaired every charitable organization worth joining and had her fingers in every social circle that mattered. The Stewart name was carved into buildings, printed on scholarship funds, and whispered with reverence at every community gathering. Cameron had grown up understanding that rules were suggestions when you had the right last name, that consequences were for other people, and that the word no was simply an opening negotiation tactic. He had ruled Jefferson High since his freshman year, not through academic achievement or genuine leadership, but through the raw charisma of someone who had never been told he couldn't have something he wanted. His inner circle, Jackson Reed, Tyler Martinez, and Brett Collins, followed him with the devotion of disciples, amplifying his cruelty and enabling his worst impulses while sharing in the social benefits of his protection. For 3.5 years, Madison had successfully avoided Cameron's notice by being aggressively unremarkable. She sat in the back, spoke only when called upon, and moved through the school's social landscape like water on rocks, finding the path of least resistance. But senior year had brought new pressures, new visibility, and new dangers. It started with the National Merit Scholarship announcement. Madison's name had been called during morning announcements, along with 2 other students, recognizing her as one of Jefferson High's semifinalists. The brief moment of applause felt like spotlights on her face, and she had caught Cameron's eyes across the auditorium for the first time in 4 years. Something in his expression had made her stomach twist, not admiration or respect, but a cold calculation that suggested he was filing away information he might use later. The second incident came during advanced placement chemistry, when Mrs. Patterson had asked the class to solve a complex equilibrium problem that stumped everyone except Madison. She had worked through the solution on the board with quiet confidence, her handwriting neat and precise, her explanation clear and methodical. When she finished, Mrs. Patterson had smiled with genuine pride and said, "Outstanding work, Madison. You'll make a brilliant chemist someday." The compliment should have felt good, but Madison noticed Cameron in the back row, his arms crossed, his jaw tight with something that looked disturbingly like resentment. After class, she had overheard him muttering to Jackson about show-offs who think they're better than everyone else, and the words had followed her home like shadows. The third incident was the one that changed everything. Prom nominations had been announced, and while Madison had never harbored any illusions about being nominated for prom queen, she was surprised to discover that someone had submitted her name as a joke candidate. The nomination list, posted outside the main office, included the usual suspects: cheerleaders, student body officers, girls who lived in the center of social circles Madison barely knew existed. And then, inexplicably, there was her name, Madison Chun, nominated by concerned classmates who think she deserves recognition. The note was anonymous, but the cruel humor was obvious to anyone who understood the school's social hierarchy. Madison Chun, the invisible genius who ate lunch in the library and had never been to a school dance, nominated for prom queen like some elaborate practical joke. The laughter started immediately. Groups of students gathered around the list, pointing and giggling, taking photos to share on social media with captions Madison didn't want to imagine. She had tried to ignore it, but the humiliation was hard to escape when teachers began congratulating her with confused smiles, when classmates she had never spoken to suddenly knew her name. When the joke took on a life of its own and spread through the school like wildfire, that's when Cameron Stewart decided she was worth his personal attention. It began with small things. Books knocked from her hands in hallways, lab equipment mysteriously rearranged when she wasn't looking, whispered comments just loud enough for her to hear about lucky scholarships and diversity picks. Madison had endured worse, but there was something different about Cameron's brand of cruelty. It was patient, methodical, designed not just to hurt but to break. He began showing up wherever she was: the library during lunch, the parking lot after school, the coffee shop where she sometimes studied on weekends. Never close enough to be accused of harassment, but close enough to make her feel watched, hunted. He would smile when their eyes met, that same charming smile that fooled adults. But his eyes held something cold and calculating that made Madison's instincts scream warnings. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, 3 weeks before prom. Madison had been working alone in the chemistry lab, preparing for the state competition that could secure additional scholarship funding for college. Lab was empty except for her, the building quiet in that particular way schools felt after hours, when the silence seemed to echo with possibility. She was focused on a complex synthesis reaction, her notebook filled with calculations and observations, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Multiple footsteps, moving with purpose. Madison looked up just as Cameron Stewart appeared in the doorway, flanked by Jackson and Tyler, their expressions suggesting this visit was anything but coincidental. "Well, well," Cameron said, his voice carrying that false friendliness that always preceded cruelty. "If it isn't our prom queen candidate, working hard as always." Madison's hands stilled on her equipment. The lab suddenly felt smaller, the exits farther away. "The lab is reserved for my research project," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. Cameron stepped into the lab, his friends following like shadows. "Research project," he repeated, mockingly. "Always so serious, Madison. Don't you ever have fun?" She began carefully packing her materials, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I should go. You can have the lab." "Actually," Cameron said, moving to block her path to the door, "I came here to talk to you about prom." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Madison's blood turned to ice. This was the conversation she had been dreading, the reason behind his sudden interest, the trap she had sensed closing around her for weeks. "I don't go to school dances," she said simply. Cameron's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "See, that's where you're wrong. Because I've decided you're going to prom with me." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Madison felt the familiar urge to shrink, to apologize, to find the path of least resistance. But something else stirred in her chest, something that had been building through years of small humiliations and quiet endurance. "That's very flattering," she said carefully, "but I already have plans that night." It was a lie, but it was her lie to tell. Cameron's expression shifted, the mask of false friendliness slipping just enough to reveal something darker underneath. "Plans," he repeated. "With who?" "That's not really your business." Jackson laughed, a sound without humor. "Everything in this school is Cameron's business, Chen. You'd better figure that out." Madison felt the walls of the lab pressing closer, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet Cameron's eyes directly. "I said no. That should be enough." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Cameron studied her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle, his head tilted slightly, his eyes narrow. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. "You know, Madison, I think you don't understand how things work around here. My family has been part of this community for 3 generations. My father employs half the parents in this school district. My mother decides which scholarships get funded and which applications get the best recommendations." He stepped closer, close enough that Madison could smell his expensive cologne, see the cold calculation in his blue eyes. "When I ask someone to prom, they say yes. It's not really a request, it's more like an honor. And turning down that honor ... well, that would be very, very stupid." Madison's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "Then I guess I'm very, very stupid." The silence that followed was deafening. Cameron's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, and finally, something that looked disturbingly like rage barely held in check. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, his voice soft but loaded with threat. "A big mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with, or what I can do to someone who embarrasses me. Is that supposed to scare me?" Before Cameron could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway, Mrs. Patterson returning from the faculty meeting. Cameron's demeanor shifted instantly, the threatening edge vanishing behind his practiced charm. "Think about it, Madison," he said, loudly enough for approaching ears to hear. "Prom is supposed to be magical. It would be a shame if you missed out on the experience." Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her expression brightening when she saw Madison. "Oh good, you're still here. How's the synthesis coming along?" "Very well," Madison replied, her voice betraying none of the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "I was just finishing up." Cameron flashed his megawatt smile at the teacher. "We were just encouraging Madison to come to prom, Mrs. Patterson. She works so hard. She deserves to have some fun." "What a lovely idea," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "Madison, you should absolutely go. You've earned some celebration." Madison packed the last of her materials, her hand steady despite everything. "I'll think about it," she said, though everyone in the room knew she was lying. As she walked past Cameron toward the door, he leaned in just close enough to whisper words only she could hear. "This isn't over. Not even close." Madison walked out of that lab knowing that her careful strategy of invisibility had failed. She had been seen, marked, targeted by someone who wasn't used to hearing the word. No one had the power to make her refusal painful. But as she drove home through the quiet streets of Roosevelt Valley, something else settled in her chest alongside. The fear. For the first time in 4 years, she had stood her ground. She had looked Cameron Stewart in the eye and refused to be intimidated. The consequences would come, she was certain of that, but in that moment, she had chosen dignity over safety, truth over convenience. Madison Chun, the invisible genius, who had spent high school apologizing for existing, had finally found her voice. She just hoped she would be strong enough to use it when the real battle began. The digital assault began at 6:47 a.m. the next morning, while Madison was reviewing organic chemistry notes over breakfast. Her phone buzzed with notifications: Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, platforms she rarely used but maintained out of social necessity. What she found made her stomach drop. Someone had created a fake account called Prom Queen Madison and posted a series of humiliating memes featuring her yearbook photo photoshopped into ridiculous scenarios. Madison in a tiara made of test tubes. Madison slow dancing with a skeleton from anatomy class. Madison giving a prom queen wave while standing next to a periodic table. The captions were cruel but clever, designed to spread like wildfire through the school's social ecosystem. Prom Queen Madison practices her acceptance speech in the chemistry lab. Read one. When your crown is made of calculators and your scepter is a Bunsen burner. Read another. The posts had hundreds of likes already, shared and reshared by classmates. who found her academic achievements suddenly hilarious when framed as social inadequacy. But the photos were just the beginning. Someone had also created a fake dating profile using her information, listing her interests as long walks through the periodic table and romantic dinners with my textbooks. The profile had been shared screenshot by screenshot, turning Madison into a punchline before the first period had even begun. Madison's parents noticed her unusual silence during breakfast. Dr. James Chun looked up from his university correspondence, his expression concerned. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" Madison considered telling them about Cameron, about the lab confrontation, about the digital humiliation spreading through her school like a virus. But her parents had sacrificed so much for her education, worked so hard to give her opportunities they had never had. The last thing she wanted was to burden them with high school drama when MAT awaited in the fall. "Just nervous about the state chemistry competition next week," she said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Her mother, Dr. Sarah Chun, reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "You've prepared wonderfully. Win or lose, we're proud of the young woman you've become." The irony of those words would haunt Madison throughout the day. At Jefferson High, the digital campaign had evolved into real-world harassment. Her locker had been decorated overnight with printouts of the memes, taped up like campaign posters. Students she had never spoken to approached her in hallways with exaggerated enthusiasm, asking about her prom queen platform and whether she planned to give her acceptance speech in Mandarin. The comments about her ethnicity stung more than the academic mockery. They reminded her that no matter how American she felt, others would always see her as foreign first. Oliver found her during lunch, his face flushed with anger. "This is insane," he said, sliding into the seat across from her in their usual library corner. "Whoever did this spent hours creating content. This isn't random bullying, this is a coordinated attack." Madison had reached the same conclusion, though she hadn't wanted to admit it. The memes were too polished, the fake profiles too detailed, the distribution too wide to be spontaneous. Someone with resources and connections had orchestrated this campaign with military precision. "It has to be Cameron," Oliver continued, keeping his voice low. "Ever since you turned him down yesterday. This starts? That's not a coincidence." Madison had told Oliver about the lab confrontation during their walk to school that morning, though she had downplayed the threatening undertones. Now surrounded by the evidence of systematic humiliation, she wondered if she had underestimated Cameron's capacity for revenge. "We should report this," Oliver said. "This is cyberbullying." "There are policies that require proof," Madison interrupted. "And even if we had proof, who do you think the administration will believe? Cameron Stewart, whose father funds the new gymnasium, or Madison Chen, the girl who doesn't fit in?" The bitter truth of her words settled between them. Oliver's face crumpled with the helpless rage of someone who understood injustice but lacked the power to fight it. The afternoon brought new humiliations. In a P. English, Mrs. Rodriguez signed a group project on contemporary social issues. Madison found herself the last person chosen, finally placed with a group that made their reluctance obvious through eye rolls and whispered complaints. During the planning discussion, one of her group mates, Ashley Williams, made passive-aggressive comments about some people thinking they're too good for everyone else, and certain people who need to learn their place. In calculus, someone had written Prom Queen Madison on the whiteboard before class, drawing snickers from students and a confused look from Mr. Thompson, who erased it without comment. During chemistry, her sanctuary, her safe space, Madison discovered that someone had mixed up her carefully organized lab materials, forcing her to spend precious time reorganizing while her classmates whispered behind their hands. But the worst moment came during sixth period, when she was called to the main office over the intercom. Every head in the classroom turned toward her, and she could feel their eyes tracking her movements as she gathered her books. The walk to The office felt like a condemned prisoner's final march, every step echoing with the certainty that whatever awaited her would be unpleasant. Principal Davidson sat behind his desk with the expression of a man trying to solve an uncomfortable problem. He was a decent administrator, but also a political creature who understood that maintaining peace often meant sacrificing individuals for the greater good. "Madison," he began carefully, "I need to talk to you about some social media activity." "That's come to my attention." Madison's heart sank. She had expected this conversation, but hoped it wouldn't come so soon. "Several parents have called about inappropriate content featuring students from our school," Principal Davidson continued. "I need you to understand that while the school doesn't control what happens on social media, we do expect our students to maintain appropriate digital citizenship." The words hit Madison like a physical blow. She was being held responsible for her own humiliation, blamed for content she hadn't created and hadn't consented to. The injustice of it left her momentarily speechless. "I didn't create any of that content," she finally managed. "I understand that's your position," Principal Davidson said, his tone suggesting he didn't entirely believe her. "But I also need you to understand that sometimes our actions have consequences we don't anticipate. Perhaps recent events could be seen as provocative by some students." Madison stared at him, trying to process the implication. Provocative? Well, the prom queen nomination situation, for instance. Some might see that as attention-seeking behavior. The accusation was so absurd, so fundamentally unfair, that Madison almost laughed. She was being blamed for a nomination she hadn't sought, criticized for participating in a joke she hadn't created, and held responsible for harassment she was experiencing. "I didn't nominate myself for prom queen," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't ask for any of this attention. I just want to finish my senior year and go to college." Principal Davidson shifted uncomfortably. "Of course, Madison. I'm not suggesting you intended to cause problems. But I need you to understand that your academic achievements and college plans have made some students feel competitive, perhaps. It would be wise to maintain a lower profile for the remainder of the year." The conversation was surreal. Madison was being asked to hide her intelligence, diminish her accomplishments, and accept harassment as the natural consequence of academic success. The message was clear. The problem wasn't the bullies, it was her refusal to make herself small enough that bullies would ignore her. "I see," Madison said quietly. "Is there anything else?" Principal Davidson looked relieved that she wasn't arguing. "Just remember that we're all part of the Jefferson High community. Sometimes being a good community member means finding ways to get along, even when we have differences." Madison left the office understanding that she was truly alone in this fight. The school administration, knowingly or not, had aligned themselves with her tormentors by framing the harassment as a natural consequence of her own behavior. She was expected to solve the problem by becoming invisible again, by apologizing for existing in a way that made others uncomfortable. The rest of the week brought a steady escalation of psychological warfare. Her car tires were deflated twice, not slashed, which would have been criminal damage, but deflated just enough to be inconvenient. Her chemistry textbook disappeared from her locker, forcing her to share with Oliver and fall behind in her preparation for the state competition. Anonymous notes appeared in her backpack with messages like, "Know your place," and "Some people need to learn humility." The social media campaign evolved daily, with new fake accounts creating increasingly elaborate mockeries of her academic life. Someone had even created a fake LinkedIn profile listing her as future CEO of Awkward Industries, with endorsements for skills like professional isolation and advanced antisocial behavior. Madison tried to maintain her routine, focusing on her studies and her research project, but the constant harassment was wearing her down. She found herself looking over her shoulder in hallways, checking her car for damage before driving home, dreading the notification sounds on her phone. Sleep became elusive as her mind raced. Through worst-case scenarios and potential escape routes, Oliver remained her stalwart ally. But even his support couldn't shield her from the growing realization that her situation was becoming untenable. The harassment wasn't random or temporary. It was systematic, persistent, and designed to break her spirit. Someone was methodically dismantling her sense of safety and belonging. Piece by piece. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon, when Oliver made a discovery that changed everything. He had been investigating the fake social media accounts, using his considerable computer skills to trace digital footprints and identify patterns. What he found was damning. All of the accounts had been created from IP addresses associated with the Stewart family's home network. The fake profiles, the humiliating memes, the coordinated harassment campaign, all of it traced back to Cameron Stewart's personal devices. "I have screenshots, timestamps, metadata," Oliver told Madison as they sat in his car after school. "This is proof. Real, undeniable proof that Cameron orchestrated this entire thing." Madison stared at the evidence on Oliver's laptop screen, feeling a mixture of vindication and dread. They finally had what they needed to expose Cameron's campaign. But she also understood that possessing the truth and being able to use it were two very different things. "What do we do with this?" she asked. Oliver's expression was grim. "We could take it to the administration, but given how Principal Davidson handled your meeting, I'm not optimistic about their response. We could go to the police, but cyberbullying. Laws are complicated, and the Stewart family has connections everywhere. Or, Madison sensed there was another option. Or we could leak it ourselves. Post the evidence online. Let the court of public opinion handle it. Sometimes social media justice works faster than the legal system." Madison considered the suggestion. Fighting fire with fire had a certain appeal, but it also meant descending to Cameron's level, engaging in the same tactics that had made her life miserable. More importantly, it meant abandoning the moral high ground that had sustained her through years of quiet endurance. "I need time to think," she said finally. That weekend, Madison made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. Instead of plotting revenge or seeking administrative intervention, she chose a different path entirely. She began preparing for war, but not the kind anyone expected. On Saturday morning, she drove to Roosevelt Valley Martial Arts Academy, a modest studio tucked between a hardware store and a Vietnamese restaurant in the older part of town. She had researched the school online, drawn by reviews that emphasized practical self-defense over flashy techniques, mental discipline over physical aggression. The instructor, Master Kim, was a compact woman in her 50s with graying hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. She listened without judgment as Madison explained her situation in general terms: harassment at school, feeling unsafe, wanting to learn to protect herself. "Self-defense isn't about fighting," Master Kim said after Madison finished her explanation. "It's about confidence, awareness, and having options when someone tries to make you a victim. But true self-defense begins in the mind, with the decision that you deserve to be safe and respected." Madison enrolled in private lessons, paying with money she had earned through tutoring other students. 3 times a week, she drove to the academy after school and learned to channel years of suppressed anger and frustration into focused technique. She practiced blocks and strikes, throws and escapes, but more importantly, she practiced the mental discipline of someone who refused to be a victim. Master Kim taught her that physical confrontation should always be the last resort, but that being prepared for it changed how you moved through the world. "When you know you can defend yourself," she explained, "you stop walking like prey. Predators notice the difference." Madison said nothing to her parents about the martial arts training, framing her absences as additional study sessions at the university library. She said nothing to Oliver, unwilling to burden him with knowledge that might put him at risk. The lessons became her secret weapon, her private preparation for a conflict she hoped would never come. but suspected was inevitable. The harassment continued throughout the following week, but Madison noticed a change in her own responses. The whispered comments still stung, but they didn't penetrate as deeply. The social media mockery still hurt, but it didn't dominate her thoughts. She was developing armor, piece by piece, technique by technique. On Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the lab confrontation, Cameron Stewart made his next move. He didn't approach her directly, he was too smart for that, especially now that teachers were beginning to notice the unusual tension surrounding Madison. Instead, he struck through intermediaries, using his influence to orchestrate a public humiliation that would be impossible to ignore or deflect. The announcement came during morning assembly. Due to irregular voting patterns in the prom queen election, the school was implementing new procedures to ensure fairness and authenticity. All nominees would be required to give brief speeches during lunch period on Friday, allowing the student body to make informed choices about their selections. Madison understood immediately that this was another trap. Cameron had somehow manipulated the voting process to force her into a public speaking situation where her discomfort and social awkwardness would be on full display. She would be required to stand in front of the entire school and pretend to campaign for a title she had never wanted, creating content for further mockery while satisfying the administration's desire to appear fair and democratic. That evening, Madison sat in her room staring at her acceptance letter from MIT, scheduled to begin in just 4 months. She had worked her entire high school career toward this moment, earning every grade and test score through pure determination and intellectual ability. College represented freedom, escape, the chance to exist in a world where brilliance was celebrated rather than punished. But first, she had to survive the next 3 weeks at Jefferson High. Madison folded the MIT letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Then she opened her laptop and began preparing for a speech that would either end her torment or escalate it beyond anything she had yet experienced. Either way, she was done hiding. The prom night that would change everything began 3 hours before the first dance, in the most unlikely of places, the Jefferson High Gymnasium, empty except for the maintenance crew setting up decorations in the main ballroom down the hall. Madison Chun stood in the center of that familiar space, wearing an emerald green dress her mother had helped her choose, elegant but practical, beautiful but not restrictive. Beneath the flowing fabric, she wore compression shorts and athletic tape preparations that would prove more valuable than any jewelry. She hadn't planned to attend prom. The speech requirement from the previous week had been a disaster, exactly as Cameron had orchestrated. Standing before 500 students, Madison had delivered her reluctant campaign with quiet dignity, but the response had been a mixture of polite applause and barely concealed mockery. She had lost the prom queen election to Brittany Walsh by a landslide, which was exactly what everyone expected and what Madison had hoped for. But Oliver had convinced her to attend anyway. "Don't let them steal this from you," he had argued. "You've earned the right to celebrate surviving high school. Besides," he had added with a wry smile, "I already rented a tux, and my date isn't backing out on me now." They had planned to make a brief appearance, take some photos, and leave early. Madison would wear her beautiful dress, prove she wasn't afraid, and then retreat to safety before the real festivities began. It was a reasonable plan that accounted for everything except Cameron Stewart's inability to let anything go. The ambush had been carefully orchestrated. Cameron and his crew, Jackson, Tyler, and Brett, had arrived at the school early, ostensibly to help with decorations, but actually to corner Madison before the dance began. They had lured her to the gymnasium with a fake message from Mrs. Patterson about emergency chemistry equipment that needed to be secured before the evening's festivities. Madison had suspected the trap the moment she walked into the empty gym, but by then it was too late. Cameron stood in the center of the space like a king holding court, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. His 3 lieutenants flanked him in formation, blocking the exits with practiced precision. "Madison," Cameron said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "So glad you could make it to our private pre-prom gathering." She stopped walking, calculating distances and angles the way Master Kim had taught her. The gymnasium was large, which gave her room to maneuver, but it also meant she was far from help. The nearest exit was 30 feet away, blocked by Tyler. The equipment room offered potential shelter, but it could also become a trap. "What do you want, Cameron?" Madison asked, her voice calm despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. Cameron began circling her slowly, like a predator, savoring the moment before the kill. "You know, Madison, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation in the chemistry lab. About respect and knowing your place, and the consequences of making poor decisions." Jackson pulled out his phone and began recording, the red light blinking like a predator's eye in the dim gymnasium lighting. "You embarrassed me," Cameron continued, his voice growing harder. "In front of my friends, in front of the school, in front of this whole town. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To have some nobody, some foreign scholarship case, treat me like I'm not worth her time?" The racial slur hung in the air like a poison cloud. Madison felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest, not fear, but anger. Pure, crystalline anger that burned away the last remnants of her desire to avoid confrontation. "I'm not foreign," she said quietly. "I was born in San Francisco. But even if I wasn't, that wouldn't give you the right to treat me like property." Cameron's laugh was ugly, filled with years of unchallenged privilege and casual cruelty. "Rights? You think you have rights here? My family built this town. My money pays for your scholarships and your fancy lab equipment. You exist here because we allow it." Brett stepped forward, holding up a tablet that showed Madison's MIT acceptance letter. Somehow they had hacked her email, violating her privacy one final time. "Look what we found," he said with mock excitement. "Our little genius thinks she's going to escape to the big city and forget all about us." "That's not going to happen," Cameron said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "See, I've been making some calls. My family has connections at MIT, donors who care about the kind of students the school admits. Character matters, Madison. And after tonight, after everyone sees what kind of person you really are, those connections are going to have some very interesting conversations with the admissions office." Tyler opened a duffel bag and pulled out Madison's research portfolio, the same project she had been working on the day Cameron first cornered her in the lab. Her heart sank as she realized they had broken into her locker, stolen her work, and brought it here as a prop for whatever humiliation they had planned. 3 years of research, Cameron said, taking the portfolio from Tyler. All that work, all those dreams of being a scientist. It would be such a shame if something happened to it. He began tearing pages slowly, methodically, letting each piece of destroyed work flutter to the gymnasium floor like confetti. Madison watched years of her life disintegrating, each torn page representing hours of careful observation, analysis, and discovery. "Stop," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You've made your point, have I?" Cameron asked, pausing in his destruction. "Because I don't think you understand the point yet. The point is that you don't get to tell me no. The point is that there are consequences for disrespecting people who matter. The point is that your little fantasy of being special, of being different, of being better than everyone else, that fantasy ends tonight." Jackson stepped closer with the camera, ensuring he captured every moment of what they believed would be Madison's complete breakdown. Tyler and Brett moved to flank her more closely, their presence designed to make her feel trapped and helpless. "Here's what's going to happen," Cameron continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering an ultimatum. You're going to get on your knees right here in front of this camera, and you're going to apologize. You're going to admit that you were wrong to think you could reject me, wrong to think you were too good for me, wrong to think you belonged in the same world as people like us." Madison felt the moment crystallize around her like glass. This was the choice Master Kim had prepared her for, the moment when someone tried to force her to accept victimhood, to surrender her dignity in exchange for the promise of safety. But Madison had learned something important during her weeks of training. Some prices were too high to pay, even for safety. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Cameron's smile was genuinely frightening. "Then we post this video online with a very different narrative. Poor, unstable scholarship student has a complete breakdown, destroys her own work, threatens violence against her classmates. MIT will revoke your acceptance before the video finishes uploading. Your parents will be devastated. Your future will be over." Brett moved closer, close enough that Madison could smell his cologne and see the anticipation in his eyes. "Just do what he says, Madison. Make this easy on yourself." Tyler reached out to grab her arm, to force her to the ground, and that's when everything changed. Madison's response was instantaneous and devastating. The wrist grab Oliver had taught her, a simple technique she had practiced hundreds of times, sent Tyler sprawling across the gymnasium floor before he understood what had happened. His surprised cry echoed off the walls as he hit the ground hard, his phone skittering away into the darkness. Brett charged forward, his face twisted with rage, but Madison was ready. She sidestepped his clumsy attack and used his momentum against him, sending him crashing into the metal bleachers with a sound like thunder. The impact left him dazed and bleeding, struggling to remember where he was. Jackson, still filming, backpedaled frantically as he realized the script had been flipped. "Cameron," he called out, his voice high with panic. "Cameron, I can see what she's doing." Cameron snarled, his perfect composure finally cracking. The entitled prince who had never faced real consequences was discovering what happened when someone refused to be intimidated. Tyler struggled to his feet, his tuxedo torn and dirty, his face flushed with humiliation. In his anger, he grabbed the nearest object, Madison's research portfolio, and flung it at her with all his strength. The binder struck her in the chest, papers scattering everywhere, but more importantly, his wild throw had put him off balance. Madison moved like lightning. Her foot connected with Tyler's solar plexus in a perfectly executed front kick that Master Kim would have been proud of. Tyler doubled over, gasping for air, and stumbled backward until he tripped over his own feet and crashed to the floor again. "Stop!" Cameron shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Stop this right now!" But Madison wasn't stopping. 3 weeks of harassment, months of careful intimidation, years of being told to be smaller and quieter and less than she was, all of it fueled the controlled fury that drove her movements. She wasn't fighting out of anger anymore. She was fighting for her right to exist without apology. Brett tried to grab her from behind, wrapping his arms around her waist in a bear hug that might have worked on someone who hadn't spent hours learning to escape exactly this kind of attack. Madison dropped her weight, grabbed his wrists, and executed a perfect hip throw that sent him flying over her shoulder and crashing into a pile of gym mats. The torn fabric happened almost by accident. As Brett fell, his flailing hand caught the delicate fabric of Madison's dress, tearing it from shoulder to waist with a sound like breaking promises. The emerald silk hung in tatters, leaving her in the compression shirt she had worn underneath practical preparation that now looked like armor. Madison stood in the center of the gymnasium, surrounded by her fallen attackers, her dress destroyed, but her dignity intact. Her breathing was steady, her stance grounded, her eyes blazing with the confidence of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. Cameron Stewart, the golden boy who had ruled Jefferson, high through charm and cruelty, stood frozen in disbelief. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. Madison Chun was supposed to be the victim, the broken girl who learned her place and accepted her fate. She wasn't supposed to be this force of nature who fought back with precision and power. "You're insane," Cameron whispered, backing away from her. "You're absolutely insane." Madison's voice, when she finally spoke, was perfectly calm. "No, Cameron, I'm finally sane. For the first time in 4 years, I'm thinking clearly." She took a step toward him, and something in her movement made him flinch. The predator had become prey, and he didn't know how to process the reversal. "You wanted to teach me my place," Madison continued, moving closer. "You wanted to show me that I don't matter, that I'm not worth respect, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity you decide to throw my way." Another step, Cameron's back hit the wall of the gymnasium. "But here's what you never understood, Cameron. My place isn't beneath you. My place isn't in the shadows, apologizing for being smart or hiding my achievements so you feel better about yourself. My place is wherever I choose to stand." Cameron made one final desperate mistake. He lunged forward, his hands reaching for her throat, his face twisted with the rage of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling around him. It was exactly the wrong move against someone who had spent weeks learning to defend herself. Madison's response was a thing of beauty, a perfect roundhouse kick that connected with Cameron's ribs and sent him spinning through the air like a broken doll. He hit the gymnasium floor hard and lay still, unconscious before his head touched the ground. Silence fell over the gymnasium like a curtain. Tyler groaned from his position near the bleachers. Brett lay motionless among the gym mats. Jackson stood frozen with his phone, still recording the destruction of everything he thought he understood about power and privilege. Madison walked over to Jackson, her torn dress trailing behind her like a battle flag. "Give me the phone," she said quietly. Jackson handed it over without resistance, his face pale with shock. Madison looked at the camera, at the recording that had captured everything from Cameron's threats to his unconscious body on the floor. "My name is Madison Chun," she said clearly. "I'm 17 years old. I'm valedictorian of Jefferson High School, and I'm going to MIT in the fall on a full scholarship that I earned through my own work and intelligence." She paused, looking directly into the lens. "For 4 years, I've been told to be smaller, quieter, less than I am so that other people could feel better about themselves. I've been harassed, threatened, and attacked because I refuse to accept. That intelligence makes someone a target, and that saying no makes someone a victim." Another pause, this one longer. "But I'm done being small. I'm done apologizing for being smart. I'm done accepting that bullies have the right to make other people's lives miserable just because they can. And I'm done pretending that the problem is the victim instead of the person choosing to be cruel." She turned the camera toward Cameron's unconscious form. "This is Cameron Stewart. He spent tonight threatening my future, destroying my work, and trying to force me to my knees because I wouldn't go to prom with him. He recorded this attack, thinking he was documenting my humiliation. Instead, he documented his own." Madison turned the camera back to herself. "To everyone watching this, you don't have to accept abuse. You don't have to make yourself smaller so that bullies feel bigger. You don't have to apologize for being smart or different or unwilling to let someone else control your life. You have the right to say no. You have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to take up space in this world." She ended the recording and handed the phone back to Jackson. "Upload it," she said. "All of it. Let everyone see exactly what happened here." By the time the police and paramedics arrived summoned by Oliver, who had grown worried when Madison didn't answer her phone, the video was already spreading across social media like wildfire. The raw footage of Cameron's threats, his destruction of Madison's work, and his ultimate defeat played on screens across Roosevelt Valley and beyond. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Cameron Stewart was arrested for assault, harassment, and destruction of property. His college acceptances were revoked, his football scholarships canceled, and his family's social standing in Roosevelt Valley crumbled under the weight of public outrage. The video evidence was so damning that even his father's legal team advised settling quickly rather than facing a public trial. Madison's story became a rallying cry for students across the country who had faced similar harassment. She received thousands of messages from young people who had been inspired to stand up for themselves, to report their own bullies, to stop accepting abuse as inevitable. MIT not only upheld her acceptance, but fast-tracked her enrollment in not only upheld her acceptance, but fast-tracked her enrollment in an Amazon to stop accepting abuse as inevitable advanced research program after her high school research project, partially destroyed but ultimately preserved, caught the attention of the polymer chemistry department. What Cameron had tried to use as a weapon became Madison's greatest victory. 3 months later, as Madison packed for college, she found a letter in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words written in Cameron's handwriting, "I'm sorry." Madison read the note once, then placed it in a box with all the other artifacts from her high school experience: the acceptance letter, photos with Oliver, certificates from her academic achievements, and the police report from prom night. She was keeping them not as trophies, but as reminders of the girl who had learned to fight for herself and won. At MIT, Madison Chun threw herself into her studies with the same intensity she had always possessed, but with a new confidence that transformed everything she touched. She became a leader in student advocacy, helping establish new policies for dealing with harassment and discrimination. Her research into polymer chemistry led to breakthroughs that earned her recognition from the National Science Foundation, but perhaps more importantly, she became a voice for students who felt invisible, powerless, or afraid. She spoke at high schools across the country, teaching young people that intelligence was strength, not weakness, and that standing up for yourself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. Years later, when Dr. Madison Chun stood in her laboratory at Stanford University, leading a team of researchers working on revolutionary medical applications for polymer chemistry, she would sometimes think about that night in the Jefferson High Gymnasium. Not with anger or sadness, but with gratitude for the moment she stopped apologizing for existing and started embracing the space she had always deserved. The shy girl who had hidden in the back of chemistry class had become a woman who changed the world one discovery at a time. And somewhere in a box in her office, kept as a reminder of how far she had traveled, lay the torn emerald dress that had been destroyed in the moment she finally learned to fight back. The message she left for future generations was simple: you are not too much. You are not too smart. You are not too different. You are exactly who you're supposed to be, and anyone who tries to make you smaller is the problem, not you. 5 years after that transformative night, Madison received an unexpected visitor at her Stanford laboratory. Oliver Martinez, now a successful graphic designer in San Francisco, walked through her research facility with the same protective instinct he had shown during their high school days, though now it was tempered with pride rather than worry. "Dr. Chun," he said with exaggerated formality, "your laboratory is slightly more impressive than our old library corner." Madison laughed, the sound echoing off the pristine white walls lined with cutting-edge equipment that would have seemed like science fiction during their Jefferson High days. "Only slightly," she agreed, embracing her oldest friend. "Though I do miss the simplicity of hiding behind chemistry textbooks." Oliver's visit wasn't purely social. He had been commissioned to design the promotional materials for a new documentary about Madison's story, part of a series exploring how individual acts of courage could spark broader social change. The filmmaker, Sarah Kim, no relation to Master Kim, though Madison often wondered about the cosmic significance of that coincidence, had been following Madison's journey for 3 years, documenting not just her academic achievements, but her continued advocacy work. The documentary crew wants to film at Jefferson High, Oliver explained as they walked through Madison's laboratory. Past students who looked up with the kind of reverence usually reserved for rock stars. They want to recreate some of the key moments, interview people who were there. Madison paused beside a complex molecular modeling system, her fingers tracing patterns in the air as she contemplated the request. Returning to Jefferson High felt like visiting a battlefield where she had won a war but lost her innocence. The building itself had been renovated since her graduation, modernized with new security systems and anti-bullying protocols that bore her name, but she wondered if the ghosts of those hallways would recognize the woman she had become. "Have you spoken to any of our former classmates recently?" Madison asked, deflecting while she processed the idea. Oliver's expression grew complex. "Actually, yes. Jackson Reed reached out to me last month. He's working as a social media coordinator for a nonprofit now, helping teens who've been cyberbullied. He wanted to apologize for his role in what happened to you, and to ask if you'd be willing to speak at one of their events." The irony wasn't lost on Madison. Jackson, who had held the camera during Cameron's attempted humiliation, now spent his days helping other victims of the same type of harassment he had once enabled. People could change, she had learned, though the process was often messy and more complicated than Hollywood redemption stories suggested. "What about the others?" Madison asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Tyler Martinez finished his community service and started a mentorship program for at-risk youth. He's actually been quite vocal about toxic masculinity and the damage it does to everyone involved. Brett Collins. Oliver hesitated. Brett's been in and out of trouble. Some people learn from their mistakes, and others just find new ways to make the same ones. Madison nodded, unsurprised. She had long ago accepted that her story's impact on others would be varied and unpredictable. Some people use trauma as a catalyst for growth, while others remain trapped by their inability to accept responsibility for their actions. And Cameron? The question emerged despite her better judgment. Oliver's pause was longer this time. Cameron's complicated. He spent 2 years in a residential treatment program after his sentencing, focusing on anger management and what his therapists called privilege blindness. He's been working construction, ironically, for a company that competes with his father's business. He wrote you several letters over the years, though I don't think he ever sent them. The revelation surprised Madison. She had occasionally wondered about Cameron's fate, though she had deliberately avoided seeking information about him. Forgiveness, she had learned, was a complex process that didn't follow neat timelines or simple formulas. His father's business never recovered from the scandal, Oliver continued. The community's perception of the Stewart family shifted pretty dramatically after the video went viral. Robert Stewart lost several major contracts and had to sell the company to avoid bankruptcy. They moved to Oregon about 3 years ago. Madison absorbed this information without satisfaction or vindication. The destruction of the Stewart family's legacy felt less like justice and more like collateral damage from a conflict that should never have happened in the first place. She had won her battle, but victory had come at a cost to everyone involved. The conversation was interrupted by one of Madison's graduate students, a brilliant young woman named Angela Foster, who approached with the respectful confidence of someone who understood she was working with scientific royalty. "Dr. Chen," Angela said, "the polymer samples from yesterday's synthesis are ready for analysis. The preliminary results look promising for the medical applications we discussed." Madison's work at Stanford focused on developing biocompatible polymers for drug delivery systems, research that could revolutionize cancer treatment by allowing medications to target specific cells while minimizing side effects. It was the kind of breakthrough science that changed lives, the culmination of the academic journey that had begun in Jefferson High's chemistry lab all those years ago. "Thank you, Angela." We'll review them after my meeting with Oliver." As Angela retreated to continue her work, Madison found herself reflecting on the strange trajectory that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had hidden in library corners was now leading research that would be published in the world's most prestigious scientific journals. The target of high school harassment had become a voice for students facing similar challenges. The victim who had been forced to fight back had discovered that sometimes fighting back was exactly what the world needed. "You know," Oliver said, reading her expression with the intuition of someone who had known her for decades, "I think you should do the documentary. Not because you owe anyone your story, but because there are kids right now sitting in chemistry labs and library corners who need to know that their current situation isn't their final destination." Madison considered his words while watching her students work with the same passionate intensity she had once brought to her own research. Each of them carried their own stories of struggle and determination, their own battles with doubt and discrimination. Some were first-generation college students, others had overcome poverty or prejudice or personal trauma to reach Stanford's laboratories. They were living proof that brilliance could emerge from anywhere and that individual transformation could ripple outward to change entire communities. That evening, Madison sat in her apartment overlooking San Francisco Bay, reviewing the documentary proposal while classical music played softly in the background. The film would explore not just her personal story, but the broader phenomenon of how social media had changed the dynamics of bullying and resistance. Her viral moment had been part of a larger cultural shift, a growing recognition that victims didn't have to suffer in silence and that bystanders had responsibilities as well as choices. The proposal included interviews with educators, psychologists, and policymakers who had studied the impact of her story on anti-bullying efforts nationwide. Schools had implemented new training programs, social media platforms had developed better reporting systems, and legislators had strengthened protections for harassment victims. Madison's roundhouse kick in a high school gymnasium had somehow helped reshape how American society thought about power, privilege, and the responsibility to protect the vulnerable. But perhaps more importantly, the documentary would feature interviews with young people who had been inspired by Madison's example to stand up for themselves and others. A 15-year-old girl in Detroit who had organized her school's first anti-harassment assembly. A transgender student in Wyoming who had successfully challenged discriminatory policies in his school district. An immigrant teenager in Texas who had reported workplace harassment and helped pass new labor protections. Madison's story had become larger than Madison herself, transformed into a symbol of resistance that belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of cruelty. The next morning brought a phone call that would add another layer to the documentary's narrative. Principal Davidson, now retired from Jefferson High, had reached out through the school district to request a private conversation with Madison. His voice on the phone carried the weight of years and regret, the tone of someone who had spent considerable time reflecting on past decisions. "Dr. Chun," he said, "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I would very much like the opportunity to apologize to you in person. Not for the cameras or the documentary, but because it's something I should have done years ago." Madison agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near Stanford, curious about what had prompted this contact after so many years of silence. When she arrived, she found a man who looked older than his years, his hair completely gray and his eyes carrying the particular sadness of someone who understood they had failed when it mattered most. "I was a coward," Principal Davidson said, without preamble after they had ordered their drinks. "I knew what was happening to you. I knew the Stewart family's influence was affecting my judgment, and I chose institutional peace over individual justice. I failed you, and I failed every student who looked to the school for protection." Madison studied his face, searching for any trace of the administrator who had made her feel responsible for her own harassment. What she found instead was genuine remorse, and a hard-earned understanding of how power dynamics could corrupt even well-intentioned people. I spent the last 5 years implementing new policies and training programs. He continued, trying to make sure what happened to you never happens to another student. But I wanted you to know that the changes came too late for you, and I'm sorry for that. Madison accepted his apology with grace, recognizing that forgiveness wasn't about absolving others of responsibility, but about freeing herself from the burden of carrying anger that served no constructive purpose. Principal Davidson's acknowledgement of his failures didn't erase the harm that had been done, but it demonstrated that people could learn from their mistakes and work to prevent others from repeating them. The documentary filming took place over several weeks, with Madison returning to Jefferson High for the first time since graduation. Walking through those familiar hallways felt surreal, like visiting a museum of her former self. The building had been updated with new security systems, peer mediation programs, and anonymous reporting mechanisms that would have made her experience dramatically different. Current students approached her with a mixture of awe and curiosity, recognizing her as both a local legend and a symbol of possibilities they might not have imagined for themselves. Madison spoke with them about the importance of academic achievement, the value of standing up for others, and the reality that change often came slowly and required sustained effort from many people working together. The final scene of the documentary was filmed in Madison's Stanford laboratory, where she stood surrounded by the fruits of her intellectual labor while reflecting on the journey that had brought her there. The torn emerald dress had been replaced by a crisp white lab coat. The frightened teenager had evolved into a confident scientist, and the victim had become an advocate whose influence extended far beyond any single moment of confrontation. People often ask me if I regret what happened that night, Madison said to the camera, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived with the consequences of her choices for years. The honest answer is complicated. I regret that it had to happen at all. I regret that other students had to witness violence, even violence in self-defense. I regret that Cameron and his friends chose cruelty over kindness, and I regret that the adults who should have protected me failed to do so. She paused, looking past the camera toward her students, who were working with the same passionate dedication she had once brought to her own studies. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret refusing to accept that intelligence makes someone a target, or that saying no makes someone a victim. And I don't regret fighting back when fighting back was the only option left. The documentary, titled The Chemistry of Courage, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and went on to win several awards for its exploration of bullying, resistance, and social change. But for Madison, the real victory came in the form of letters from young people around the world who had watched her story and found the strength to write their own. The international response was overwhelming and unexpected. Madison received correspondence from students in dozens of countries, teenagers in South Korea facing academic pressure and social isolation, young women in Brazil dealing with gender-based harassment, immigrant children in Germany struggling with xenophobic bullying. Her story had transcended cultural boundaries, speaking to universal experiences of powerlessness and the human need for dignity. One letter particularly moved her, arriving from a 16-year-old girl named Priya Sharma in Mumbai, India. Priya wrote about being the only girl in her advanced mathematics program, facing constant ridicule from male classmates who believed girls couldn't excel in STEM fields. After watching Madison's documentary, Priya had organized a support group for female students in her school and successfully petitioned for anti-harassment policies in her district. "Your courage gave me permission to stop hiding my intelligence," Priya wrote. "I realized that being brilliant isn't something to apologize for. It's something to celebrate and protect." Madison responded to every letter personally, understanding that each one represented someone who had chosen bravery over silence. She established the Chun Foundation, using proceeds from speaking engagements and documentary royalties to fund anti-bullying programs in schools worldwide. The foundation focused particularly on supporting academically gifted students who faced harassment for their achievements, providing resources, mentorship, and legal assistance when necessary. The foundation's first major initiative was the creation of safe spaces for smart kids, a network of after-school programs where academically advanced students could pursue their interests without fear of social repercussions. The programs combined intellectual enrichment with social-emotional learning, teaching students not just advanced mathematics and science, but also conflict resolution, assertiveness training, and peer advocacy skills. Dr. Maria Santos, the Foundation's first program director, had been inspired to leave her position at the Department of Education to join Madison's mission. A former victim of academic harassment herself, Dr. Santos understood the unique challenges faced by intellectually gifted students in environments that prioritize social conformity over academic excellence. Madison's story resonated with me because it showed that defending your right to be smart isn't selfish, it's necessary for society. Dr. Santos explained during the Foundation's first annual conference. Every time a brilliant mind is silenced or diminished by bullying, we all lose the potential discoveries, innovations, and solutions that mind might have contributed to the world. The conference, held at Stanford University, brought together educators, researchers, and students from around the globe to discuss evidence-based approaches to supporting academically gifted youth. Madison delivered the keynote address, but the real power of the event came from panel discussions featuring students who had transformed their own experiences with harassment into advocacy and action. Among the panelists was David Kim, a 17-year-old from Seattle who had created an app called Ally Alert that allowed students to anonymously report bullying incidents and request peer support. The app had been adopted by school districts across Washington State and was being piloted in other regions. Another speaker was Isabella Rodriguez from Phoenix, who had started a YouTube channel called Brilliant and Brave, where she interviewed young people who had overcome academic harassment to pursue their dreams in STEM fields. Her channel had garnered over 2 million subscribers and had become a go-to resource for students seeking encouragement and practical advice. Perhaps most powerfully, the conference featured a presentation by Dr. James Martinez, Tyler's older brother who had become a clinical psychologist specializing in adolescent development. Dr. Martinez spoke candidly about watching his younger brother participate in Madison's harassment and the family's journey toward understanding and accountability. Bullying doesn't happen in a vacuum, Dr. Martinez explained. It's supported by systems and cultures that fail to value empathy and respect. My brother's actions were his responsibility, but they were also symptoms of broader problems: toxic masculinity, privilege, the normalization of cruelty as social bonding. Real change requires addressing these root causes, not just punishing individual incidents. The presentation was difficult for many audience members to hear, but it represented an important evolution in how society approached bullying prevention. Rather than focusing solely on punishing perpetrators or protecting victims, the new approach emphasized cultural transformation and the responsibility of entire communities to create environments where harassment couldn't flourish. Madison found herself increasingly called upon to speak at universities, conferences, and government hearings about the intersection of academic achievement and social dynamics. Her scientific credibility lent weight to her advocacy work, while her personal experience provided emotional resonance that policy papers alone couldn't achieve. During a hearing before the House Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education, Madison testified about the need for federal funding to support anti-bullying programs, specifically designed for academically gifted students. Her testimony included research data showing that intellectually advanced students faced higher rates of harassment than their peers, often leading to underachievement, school avoidance, and mental health issues. When we allow bright students to be targeted for their intelligence, Madison told the assembled legislators, "We're not just harming individual children, we're undermining our nation's capacity for innovation and progress." The student being bullied for getting the highest test score today might be the researcher who cures cancer tomorrow, if we give them the support they need to thrive. The hearing resulted in the inclusion of provisions for gifted student support in the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, allocating federal funds for training teachers to recognize and address academic harassment. Madison's influence extended beyond policy advocacy into popular culture. Her story inspired a best-selling young adult novel, a feature film that premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival, and even a Broadway musical that explored themes of identity, courage, and the cost of conformity. While Madison maintained some distance from these adaptations, understanding that artistic interpretation would inevitably diverge from literal truth, she appreciated their potential to reach audiences who might not otherwise encounter her message. The Broadway production, in particular, surprised her with its nuanced exploration of the characters, motivations, and the systemic factors that enabled Cameron's behavior. Rather than presenting a simple story of good versus evil, the musical examined how privilege, fear, and social pressure could corrupt even well-intentioned people while celebrating the transformative power of refusing to accept injustice. Madison attended the opening night performance with her parents, who had watched their daughter's journey from victim to advocate with a mixture of pride and protective concern. Dr. James Chun and Dr. Sarah Chun had initially worried that Madison's public profile might overshadow her scientific work, but they had come to understand that her advocacy was an extension of her research. Both involved identifying problems, developing solutions, and working persistently toward positive change. "Your mother and I came to America believing that education could change everything," Dr. James Chun told Madison after the performance. "Watching you use your education to change the world for others, that's the American dream we hoped for, but never dared to expect." The musical's success led to productions in London, Toronto, and Sydney, spreading Madison's story to international audiences and inspiring local adaptations that addressed bullying and academic harassment in different cultural contexts. Each production donated a portion of its proceeds to anti-bullying organizations in their respective regions, creating a global network of support for students facing similar challenges. Meanwhile, Madison's scientific career continued to flourish. Her research into biocompatible polymers had led to several breakthrough discoveries, including a drug delivery system that could cross the blood-brain barrier to treat previously untreatable neurological conditions. The work earned her recognition from the MacArthur Foundation, making her one of the youngest recipients of the Genius Grant in the award's history. The MacArthur Fellowship provided Madison with additional resources to expand her foundation's work and pursue more ambitious research projects. She used the funding to establish international partnerships with universities in developing countries, supporting students who showed exceptional promise in STEM fields, but lacked access to advanced educational opportunities. One such partnership with the University of Ghana led to the discovery of a promising young chemist named Kwame Asante, whose research into traditional medicinal plants had identified compounds with potential anti-cancer properties. Madison arranged for Kwame to spend a year at Stanford, where their collaboration resulted in the development of a new class of cancer medications derived from natural sources. "Science is a global enterprise," Madison explained during a TED Talk that would be viewed by millions worldwide. "Brilliant minds exist everywhere, but opportunity doesn't. Our responsibility as established researchers is to identify and nurture talent wherever we find it, regardless of geography, economics, or social circumstances." The TED Talk, titled "The Periodic Table of Human Potential," used the metaphor of chemical elements to explore how individual talents could combine in unexpected ways to create powerful new compounds of knowledge and innovation. Madison's presentation seamlessly wove together her scientific expertise and advocacy experience, demonstrating how her personal journey had informed her understanding of human potential and social responsibility. The response to the TED Talk was extraordinary, generating millions of views and inspiring educators around the world to adopt Madison's approach to talent identification and development. Schools began implementing periodic table programs that celebrated diverse forms of intelligence and encouraged students to see themselves as valuable elements in a larger system of human knowledge. As Madison approached her 30th birthday, she reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had brought her from a frightened teenager in Jefferson High's library to an internationally recognized scientist and advocate. The girl who had once hidden behind chemistry textbooks now stood before audiences of thousands, sharing her story and inspiring others to find their own voices. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of her impact came in the form of a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in spring, written on Roosevelt Valley University letterhead. The envelope contained an invitation to serve as the commencement speaker for Jefferson High School's graduating class, the same institution where she had once felt invisible and unwelcome. The invitation came from Principal Maria Gonzalez, who had replaced Principal Davidson and had spent 5 years implementing the anti-bullying reforms that bore Madison's name. The letter explained that the students themselves had requested Madison as their speaker, viewing her as a symbol of resilience and possibility. "Your story isn't just about overcoming bullying," Principal Gonzalez wrote. "It's about the responsibility. We all have to create environments where every student can thrive. Our graduates want to hear from someone who understands both the challenges they faced and the opportunities that await them." Madison accepted the invitation, understanding that returning to Jefferson High as the commencement speaker would represent a full-circle moment in her journey. The frightened girl who had been told to know her place would return as a woman who had claimed her space in the world and used it to make room for others. The speech she prepared wasn't about revenge or vindication, but about the ongoing work of building a society that valued intelligence over conformity, courage over compliance, and the infinite potential that existed within every individual, brave enough to refuse to be diminished by the fears and limitations of others. Madison Chun had found her voice in the most unlikely place, not in a classroom or a laboratory, but on a gymnasium floor, surrounded by the wreckage of bullies who had finally met someone who refused to be broken. And she had never been quiet again, using that voice to ensure that future generations would never have to fight their battles alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.